Hello and welcome to one and all. In this class, we will check out the next 5 marks question from Unit 2, Properties of Indifference Curves. In the previous class, I explained to you about the indifference curve and its assumptions, isn't it? Now the next one is the properties of indifference curve. So SAQ 8, explain the concept of indifference curve and discuss its properties. So the meaning of indifference curve will be the same which I have mentioned in the previous answer, and I explained to you with the diagram also. So indifference curve is a diagram representing various combinations of two goods at different points giving the same level of satisfaction to the consumer. So you are supposed to write the meaning also, because the question is explain the concept of indifference curve. Okay, now let us move on to what are all the properties of indifference curves. So the first one, an indifference curve is negatively sloped towards down. This is because if the consumer increases the consumption of one good, say X, he has to decrease the consumption of another good, Y. So let me explain to you with the help of the diagram. So you can see in this diagram, what can you see? If the consumer has to keep on increasing the commodity X, he has to decrease the quantity of commodity Y. See, if the curve is negative sloping means what? It is downward sloping. So this is the shape of the indifference curve, isn't it? It is a downward sloping. So that means what? If the one commodity has to be increased, then another commodity X has to be increased, then commodity Y has to decrease, then only it will be a downward sloping. This is the first property. Suppose if the indifference curve is not negatively sloped, if it is positively sloped. Okay, now positively sloped means what? So this is negative sloping. Okay, if it is downward sloping, that is what is we mean by negative slope. Now suppose, let us assume this is positively sloped. Positively sloped means what? This is upward sloping. Okay, X and Y. So positively sloped means, suppose if this indifference curve is positively sloped upwards, so this is positive slope. So if it is sloping upwards, then that's what it means as positive slope. Now what happens if it is positively sloped? So you can see that the consumer can increase the consumption of both the commodities. Okay, now this is also 1 unit of commodity X, Y and 1 unit of commodity X, and now again he can move on to 2 units of commodity X and 2 units of commodity Y. So like that, the consumer can keep on 3 units of commodity X and 3 units of commodity Y. So this is against the principle of indifference curve. Okay, so it is against the principle of indifference curve. That is one thing. And even in practically also, since the income of the consumer is limited and the nature of the consumer, only to a certain extent the consumer can consume. The consumer cannot keep on increasing the quantities of all the commodities. Okay, so it is the nature of the human consumer. Nobody is having that much capacity. That is one thing. And since the income is also limited for the consumer, remember, human wants are unlimited, means are limited. Okay, so since the income of the consumer is also limited, if the consumer has to consume one more unit, he has to decrease the consumption of another commodity. So that is also another reason we are assuming a consumer is rational. If you remember, one of the assumptions of indifference curve, consumer acts rationally. Okay, so it is not only maximum satisfaction. Any rational consumer, if he has to increase the consumption of one commodity, he has to decrease the consumption of another commodity. Okay, so that is also another reason we are assuming consumer is rational. So this is the reason the first property, indifference curve is negatively sloped. Okay, now we will check out what is the second property of indifference curve. Okay, now the second property is indifference curves are always convex to the origin. So indifference curves are convex to the origin due to decreasing marginal rate of substitution. Okay, now let me again explain to you with the help of a diagram. So now what is happening? This is convex. The shape is like that. This is convex. Okay, now you can see that, see in the first diagram also, you can see that this is convex. This diagram, you can see that initially the consumer wants to sacrifice 4 units of commodity Y to get 1 unit of commodity X. Then he is willing to sacrifice only 3 units of commodity Y for 1 more unit of commodity X. So then 2 units for 1 more unit, and then 1 unit for 1 unit. So this is the delta Y by delta Y, this is delta X. Okay, so this is marginal rate of substitution. Now you can see that is marginal rate of substitution is substituting commodity X for commodity Y, but the rate at which the consumer is substituting keeps on decreasing. So that's why from 4, 3, 2, 1 the rate of substitution keeps on decreasing. So this is convex. Suppose for example, if the indifference curve is concave, okay, now the second property we are assuming, the property of indifference curve is, it is not assumption, the property of second property of indifference curve is it has to remain convex. Suppose let us assume if it is concave. So if it is concave, what will happen? So this is the shape of concave. Okay, so now what is happening? So you can see that this delta Y is keeps on increasing. So you can see that this gap keeps on increasing. Okay, isn't it? That means what? That marginal rate of substitution is increasing instead of decreasing. So in this case, the MRS, the marginal rate of substitution, is increasing instead of decreasing. This is again against the principle of indifference curve. Okay, so in this curve, so this is also not correct, against the principle of indifference curve. So if you check in this diagram here, the marginal rate of substitution and the MRS is decreasing. Okay, so this is the correct one. Okay, so that's why the second principle or the second property of indifference curve is the indifference curve will never be concave to the origin. So indifference curve will always be convex to the origin. This shape is called as the convex. Okay, that is the second property. Now let us move on to the third property. Now what is the third property? Indifference curves can never intersect each other. IC curves can never intersect because if two IC curves intersect, it implies two different levels of satisfaction, which is not proper. Again, moving on to the diagram. If I explain to you with the help of a diagram, it will be easy for you to understand. Now the third property, what is it say? Indifference curve should not intersect with each other. Now we all know what is the meaning of indifference curve, isn't it? Now this is indifference curve IC1. So we all know that this is commodity Y here, commodity X in X-axis. Okay, so we all know that all the points on the indifference curve, okay, 1, 2, 3. So all the points on the indifference curve IC1, 1, 2, 3 is going to give the same level of satisfaction. So 1, 2, 3 in the sense the combinations of each and every point on the indifference curve represent the combinations of two goods. Okay, so combination 1 represents one combination of commodity X and commodity Y. 2 represents another combination of commodity X and commodity Y. 3 represents one more combination of commodity X and commodity Y. So whatever, all those combinations are going to give the consumer the same level of satisfaction. That is an indifference curve, isn't it? We have already checked that. This is IC1. Suppose let us have IC2. So I am drawing the intersection at both the IC curves, they are intersecting. So I am drawing another IC curve. Let me mark it as IC2. Okay, now there are combinations on IC2 also. Let me mark this as 4. 2 is already there, and let me mark one more, 5. Now what are all the combinations we are finding on IC2? So IC2 is having the combinations 4, 2 and 5. So these three also should give the same level of satisfaction to the consumer, isn't it? Any combination on the indifference curve should give the consumer the same level of satisfaction. Just like 1, 2, 3 combinations on IC1 is giving the same level of satisfaction to the consumer, 4 to 5 on the IC2 should also give the same level of satisfaction to the consumer. But then what you are observing that combination 4 should give lesser satisfaction than combination 1 on IC1, isn't it? Because combination 4 is on a lower indifference curve, isn't it? So combination 4 should give lesser satisfaction. This combination 4 is on IC2. Combination 1 is on IC1. So combination 4 is giving the lower satisfaction than combination 1. And what about 5? Combination 5 on IC2 is giving greater satisfaction than combination 3 on IC1. So how is it possible? So all the points on the indifference curve should give the same level of satisfaction, but some of the combinations on IC2 is giving lesser satisfaction than the combinations on IC1. Some of the combinations on IC2 is giving more satisfaction than IC1. So this is again, this is absurd, isn't it? So that is why no two indifference curve should intersect each other. They should be parallel. So it should be like that only. Indifference curve should always be like that only. It should be parallel. They should not intersect. Okay. So IC1, IC2, IC3. So like that they should not intersect. Okay. That is the meaning of no two indifference curve should intersect. Okay. Then the next property is a higher indifference curve represents a higher level of satisfaction than a lower indifference curve. So IC to the right yields more satisfaction to the consumer as it contains more number of goods than IC on the left. Okay, so again going back to the diagram. So this is, I mentioned to you the fourth property. I mentioned to you indifference curves are parallel. Okay, so let us have a set of indifference curves, commodity X and commodity Y. So this is IC1. Okay, so now all the points on the indifference curve is going to give the consumer same level of satisfaction. Now he can move to IC2. This is parallel, it's not intersecting. He can move to IC2. Assume the income of the consumer has increased. Okay, still he is sacrificing one commodity, he is reducing the consumption of one commodity in order to get another commodity. Still it is negative sloping only. Okay, but since his income is increased, he can move from IC1 to IC2. Now you can see that IC1, this is the quantity of commodity X and commodity Y he can purchase. Okay, now suppose if the income of the consumer is increasing, now what he can do? He can purchase any of the combinations lying on the IC2. So you can see that he can purchase more of commodity, any one of the commodity or both the commodities. Okay, so these are all the points. So now what we are observing here, he can purchase more units of commodity X and commodity Y. So like that, if the income still keeps on increasing, if the income of the consumer still keeps on increasing, he can still move on to the another IC curve, that is IC3. So the IC curve on the right hand side is giving more satisfaction to the consumer than the IC curve on the left hand side, because the right hand side IC indifference curve, the consumer can get more quantities of commodity X and commodity Y with this money income and with the prices of the commodities. Okay, because we remember we assume the money income of the consumers to remain constant. So if the money income of the consumer is remaining constant, he can purchase any of the combinations lying on the IC1. Suppose if the money income of the consumer has increased it's not remaining constant. Suddenly the money income of the, we are taking that also into consideration, as we are giving the provision for the rise in the money income of the consumer. So the money income of the consumer has increased from 10,000 to 20,000. Then what happens? Then we can see that the consumer can increase the purchase consumption of both commodity X and commodity Y. Still, if the consumer's money income increases to 30,000, still he can move on to higher level of indifference score. So that's why higher indifference score gives more satisfaction to the consumer than the lower indifference score, because higher indifference score gives more level of more quantities of both commodity X and commodity Y. Now what is that higher indifference score means? Any indifference score which is on the right hand side, that is the higher indifference score. So IC3 is giving more satisfaction than IC2. Okay, so this is also on the part of the rational consumer. A rational consumer always wants to have more units of commodity X and commodity Y, provided his income and provided his budget permits, and his, of course, he is having the capacity also. So even though he is moving on the higher indifference curve, he is still reducing the quantity of one commodity if he has to purchase the quantity of another commodity. Okay, so this is the fourth property, and this is what is known as the indifference map. So this is indifference, you might get even for 2 marks. So let me draw this again properly. So set of indifference curve. So this is IC1, IC2, IC3. So a set of, so like that, so commodity X and commodity Y. So this is what is known as indifference map. Okay, you might get that for 2 marks. So indifference map means a set of indifference curve drawn on different income levels. Okay, so this is what is called as the indifference map. So these are all the properties of indifference curve. Okay, thus these are all the properties of indifference curve. So if you have any doubts, please mention that in the comment box. Okay, otherwise if you find this video useful, please like, share and also subscribe to my YouTube channel. So until my next class, take care. Bye bye.